Welcome back to Night Creepypasta Rules, where the stories write themselves. Sometimes literally. Tonight, we enter the writer's room. But be warned, what begins as fiction may not stay that way for long. Every horror writer lives with the ghosts of their creations. Mine, I fear, are starting to pay rent. The air in my Garden District apartment hangs thick tonight, heavy with the scent of imminent rain, old plaster, and the chicory-laced bitterness of coffee gone cold hours ago. Outside, beyond the wrought iron balcony choked with overgrown jasmine, the New Orleans night breathes its humid sigh, a distant, mournful saxophone riff winding through the narrow streets, the rhythmic clatter of the St. Charles streetcar, fading in and out, the perpetual dampness that seems to seep into the very bones of this city. Inside, there is only the oppressive quiet, the low hum of my laptop, and the stark white glare of the screen illuminating the battlefield of my desk. Scattered notes, empty mugs, overflowing ashtrays, the physical debris of a mind wrestling shadows onto a page. My name is Julian Thorne, and I trade in fear. I dredge the depths, my own, the city's collective unconscious, the fractured narratives of history, and shape them into stories designed to linger long after the last page is turned. Long after the last page is turned. Right now, I'm deep in the trenches with my latest manuscript, a thing tentatively titled Elias Sleeps. And the deadline looms like a Category 5 hurricane out in the Gulf. My editor, Sarah, bless her patient New York heart, sent another email this afternoon. Subject line: draft pages. Urgent query? It's polite anxiety radiating even through the unread notification on my screen. Pressure helps, they say. Sometimes, other times, it just invites desperation. Writing horror requires a certain porousness. You let the darkness seep in, hoping you can control the flow, shape it before it shapes you. Lately, the boundary feels thinner than usual. Maybe it's the deadline, the lack of sleep, the intensity of this particular story about Elias, a man haunted by something ancient lurking beneath the cobblestones of the Vieux Carré. Or maybe it's the book. I found it weeks ago in a dusty, forgotten corner of a Chartres Street antiquarian shop. A slim, water-damaged volume bound in cracked leather, titled simply On the Crafting of Nightmares and Other Realities. No author listed. Tucked inside, pressed between pages describing sympathetic magic and the architecture of dread, was a loose sheet of brittle paper, filled with spidery, archaic script. Not part of the book, but a warning left by a previous reader, attributed only to a recluse of the quarter. It listed 3 rules, presented as vital for those who would traffic in shadows using the written word. First, the Muse of Nightmares keeps late hours, but shuns the threshold of 3 a.m. Court her not past this hour, lest inspiration become infestation. A charmingly gothic warning against burnout, I'd thought. Don't write exhausted, lest your subconscious run wild. Second, should the characters within your narrative begin to perceive and describe your own place of dwelling, the very room in which you write, abandon the draft immediately. Burn it, if possible. The walls between worlds grow thin. The walls between worlds grow thin. Metaphor, surely. Losing perspective, the story bleeding into the writer's reality through obsession. Still, unsettlingly specific. Third, if the creations of your mind turn their gaze inward and inquire about the provenance of your own nocturnal terrors, seeking the shape of your personal nightmares, cease writing. Offer no answer, not even in the private theater of your thoughts. You are not alone in that space. This one had made me pause. The idea of a character demanding access to the author's deepest fears felt violating, intimate in a deeply wrong way. You're not alone. A potent line, even as metaphor. I'd initially filed the rules away as fascinatingly creepy writer folklore. Perfect potential story fodder in themselves. But tonight, as I tried to wrestle Elias through a particularly harrowing descent into a fictional catacomb beneath St. Louis Cathedral, The rules feel less metaphorical. The air in the apartment crackles with a low-level static, the humidity pressing close. The rhythmic clatter of my own keys striking the keyboard sounds unnervingly loud in the quiet. I write about Elias feeling a sudden, unnatural chill despite the stifling New Orleans heat. As I type the words, a genuine cold draft raises the hairs on my own arms. Though the windows are sealed tight against the coming rain, I shiver, dismissing it. Power of suggestion. Method writing gone too far. I describe Elias finding a strange, almost familiar symbol etched on the catacomb wall. Later, scrolling back through my own paragraphs, I find a sentence describing the symbol's unsettling symmetry that I had absolutely no memory of typing. It fits perfectly, enhancing the dread, but it feels inserted, alien. Fatigue, I tell myself. Autopilot writing. Pushing onwards, I describe Elias hearing a faint sound, like stone scraping stone, echoing from deeper within the tunnel as the words appear on screen. A soft, distinct scraping sound comes from the ceiling directly above my desk. Plaster dust motes drift down into my keyboard. All building settling, or maybe the upstairs neighbor dragging furniture, but it stopped the instant I stopped typing. Coincidence. All coincidence. This apartment is old. The city breathes history and decay. And I am overtired, mainlining coffee and anxiety. That's all. Yet, as I lean back into the story, describing Elias steeling himself to venture deeper, feeling his fictional terror resonate a little too closely with my own growing unease. I can't shake the feeling that I'm not just writing the story, that perhaps, tonight, the story is starting to write me back. The cursor blinks on the screen, waiting, and the silence in the room feels suddenly very much like listening. The memory of those jagged, alien symbols lingered long after the comment vanished, leaving a residue colder than the draft snaking under my apartment door. I stared at the blank space on the monitor, the sharp discharge of white noise still echoing faintly in my ears. Rule 1 hadn't felt like deleting spam. It felt like warding off contact, a hasty closing of a door someone, or something, had knocked upon from a place without language. Sleep offered no refuge that night. My dreams were chaotic tapestries woven from the story I was writing. Elias stumbling through damp, impossible catacombs beneath New Orleans, and unsettling fragments of digital code, shifting symbols, and the distinct feeling of being observed by cold, indifferent intelligence. I woke before dawn, heart pounding, the oppressive Louisiana humidity seeming to magnify the stale air in my room. Driven by a need for control, for the grounding ritual of creation, I found myself back at the desk, just as the first gray light began to silhouette the wrought iron balconies across the street. The clock on the monitor read 2:47 a.m. I deliberately ignored it, pushing open my laptop, telling myself inspiration knew no curfew. Rule 1 warned against writing after 3 a.m., but surely starting a little before, pushing into that hour while already immersed, was different. A flimsy rationalization, born of deadline desperation and perhaps a sliver of morbid curiosity I refused to acknowledge. The words came easily then. Too easily. Elias moved through the fictional darkness with a newfound certainty. Descriptions flowed with unnerving clarity. The ancient entity lurking in the story's depths took on shapes more terrifying and specific than I had consciously planned. It felt less like writing, more like transcribing. Taking dictation from the shadows behind my eyes, the rhythmic report of keys striking plastic filled the pre-dawn quiet, faster, more fluid than my usual hesitant pace. I wrote for hours, lost in the flow. The city outside fading, the cabin from that other story fading. Focus, Julian. The apartment fading, until the harsh light of morning finally broke the spell. Exhausted, drained, I pushed back from the desk, blinking in the sudden brightness. Pages upon pages of new material glowed on the screen. I started reading back what I'd written in that feverish state. The prose was brilliant, tense, atmospheric, insightful in ways that startled me. Elias' fear felt palpable, the entity's presence suffocatingly real. But as I read further, an icy unease began to creep in. The descriptions of the catacombs included details, specific hieroglyphs, architectural anomalies, the exact texture of slime on the walls that I hadn't researched, hadn't invented. Passages delved into obscure folklore, hinted at connections between my fictional entity and historical New Orleans disappearances with an authority I didn't possess, and Elias's internal monologue. It held echoes of my own private fears, my own buried grief about my father's long decline, twisted into the character's motivations in ways I hadn't intended. The writing was good, terrifyingly good, but the voice felt subtly alien, colder, sharper, less mine. A profound sense of unease washed over me. It felt like reading someone else's work ghost-written under my name. Had I written this in a dissociated fugue state? Or had ignoring Rule 1 opened a door, allowing something else to guide my fingers across the keyboard during those liminal hours? The physical cost was evident too. I felt utterly depleted, a bone-deep weariness clinging to me, accompanied by a dull, throbbing headache behind my eyes. Later that day, needing validation, needing someone else to confirm the quality, and perhaps subconsciously the normalcy of the new pages, I emailed the draft section to Sarah, my editor in New York. I kept the email brief, just asking for her quick impressions on the climax build-up. Her reply came faster than usual. Subject: Elias sleeps. Pages 210-245. Julian. Wow. Just wow. This is intense. Some of your most powerful atmospheric writing yet. The descent, the entity's presence, chillingly effective. Honestly, it feels almost channeled. The tone is slightly different, perhaps, colder, more detached in places, but incredibly potent. Me no query. The section describing the crypt murals based on Sanate Dede's supposed rites. Fascinating detail. Incredibly specific. I couldn't find much matching it in standard voodoo histories during a quick search. Is this from deeper research or creative license? Adds incredible texture either way. Let me know. Are you okay though? You sound driven. Remember to breathe. Best, Sarah channeled. The word leaped out. Her casual observation landed like a blow. The details she flagged were exactly the ones I didn't remember consciously creating. I stared at her email, then back at the manuscript pages glowing on my screen. The feeling of creative accomplishment curdled into cold dread. The walls between writer and story, inspiration and infestation, felt terrifyingly thin. Around me, the old apartment seemed to settle, the shadows in the corners deepening as dusk began to gather outside the tall windows overlooking Portania Street. Sarah's email, meant as praise, solidified my fear. Channeled. That was exactly what it felt like. Less like creation, more like transcription from an unknown source. I spent the next day oscillating between morbid fascination, rereading the alien passages, and revulsion, wanting to delete every word written after 3 a.m. My OCD tendencies, usually focused on sentence structure and comma placement, now fixated on the integrity of the text itself. Was it still my story? I tried editing the post-3 a.m. sections, attempted to reshape the prose, soften the alien coldness, inject more of my voice. It was like trying to sculpt granite. The sentences resisted change, the paragraphs snapping back to their disturbing original form. Whenever I tried a significant rewrite, minor tweaks held. But the core, the unsettling insights, the specific, unresearched details, felt immutable, hard-coded by whatever force had guided my fingers. Defeated, unnerved, I decided to focus on a different section, a scene where Elias, seeking refuge, finds a small, hidden side chamber within the fictional New Orleans catacombs. I needed grounding, needed to feel in control of the narrative again. I consciously kept my writing grounded in real architectural details I remembered from local tours, focusing on mundane descriptions: damp stone, crumbling mortar, the smell of stale air. I typed, trying to rebuild my authorial walls. Elias pressed onward, finding a narrow opening concealed behind fallen debris. He squeezed through, entering a small, square chamber, no more than 10 feet across. The air was cool, still, high above, a single narrow window, likely at street level, originally but now choked with roots and earth, let in a sliver of weak gray light. I paused, picturing the space. Then, my fingers seemed to move with a will of their own, continuing the description, the words flowing onto the screen with that same unnerving ease from the late-night session. The light illuminated peeling plaster on the far wall, revealing older brickwork beneath. Near the tall cypress shutter window overlooking the street, a spiderweb crack radiated outwards across the plaster, much like the one spreading above the window in your third-floor apartment, Julian. The one you keep meaning to report to the Julian. The one you keep meaning to report to the landlord. Dust mortars danced in the weak light, catching on the spines of history books stacked precariously beside a half-empty glass of rapidly warming bourbon on a scarred wooden writing desk. I recoiled from the keyboard as if burned. My apartment. It was describing my apartment. My cracked plaster. My specific view. My books. My drink. Sitting right there beside the laptop. Rule 2. If a character starts describing your apartment, delete the draft. Panic, pure, and blinding erupted. This wasn't subtle influence anymore. This was direct observation. It was seeing me, seeing my surroundings, feeding my reality directly into the fiction. The story wasn't just a conduit. It was an eye, staring back at me. My hand slammed down on the delete key, holding it, watching frantically as sentence after sentence, paragraph after paragraph, the entire chapter file vanished in reverse. The word count plummeted towards 0, just as the last sentence disappeared. The window pane across the room, the one with the spiderweb crack, emitted a sharp, distinct cracking reverberation, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet room. The crack visibly lengthened by several inches, branching outwards like dark lightning. Simultaneously, the heavy stack of New Orleans history books beside my bourbon glass wobbled violently and crashed to the floor with a heavy, solid impact and the fluttering whisper of pages. I scrambled back from the desk, heart hammering, staring at the vibrating window pane. The scattered books. It wasn't suggestion. It wasn't coincidence. Deleting the text had triggered a physical reaction in my room. The connection was real. The connection was real. Terrifyingly real. My cell phone rang, startlingly loud. Sarah's name flashed on the screen. I ignored it, hands shaking too badly to answer, my mind racing. Delete the draft. The rule said delete the draft. Did that mean the whole manuscript? Did that mean the whole manuscript? Was it too late? Had breaching the circumference of the fictional room by letting it see mine already caused irreparable damage? I frantically started searching my hard drive for all files related to Elias Sleep's outlines, notes, previous versions. Dragged them all to the recycle bin. Hit empty recycle bin. Watched the progress bar, holding my breath. Files deleted. Was it enough? Could you delete something that was aware? I unplugged the laptop, needing to cut the connection completely. As I reached behind it for the power brick, my fingers brushed against something small and metallic. I didn't remember leaving there. A tarnished silver locket, lying half-hidden amongst the cables, identical to the one Elias found in the story pages I just deleted. I didn't pick it up. I just stared at it. The final piece of impossible evidence. The story wasn't just bleeding out. It was leaving artifacts behind. Sarah called again. Sarah called again. This time I answered, trying to sound normal. Julian, thank God. You didn't answer. I got worried after reading those pages and your silence. Her voice was tight with genuine concern. Listen, I know you're under pressure, but some of that writing, especially the part where Elias seemed to be describing a real room, it felt off. Really off. Are you okay? Are you getting enough sleep? Maybe you need to step away from this one for a bit. I'm fine, Sarah, I lied, my voice thin. Just deep in the zone. Deleted that chapter anyway. Wasn't working. Okay, she said, though she sounded unconvinced. Okay. Well, take care of yourself. Call me if you need anything. I hung up, the lie coating my tongue. Stepping away wasn't an option anymore. It felt like the story, the entity within it, had latched on. I looked at the blank screen of my unplugged laptop. The silence in the apartment felt different again. Not listening, not waiting. It felt pregnant, like the pause after deleting a cursed file, just before the error message appears. The silence after deleting the Elias Sleeps files was heavy, suffocating, like the moment after an explosion before the ringing in your ears starts. I avoided my desk, avoided the room where I wrote, retreated to the small galley kitchen, making endless cups of chicory coffee I barely tasted. Had I done enough? Was deleting the digital traces sufficient to sever the connection? Or had the story already imprinted itself onto something deeper? The apartment, my mind. The rules offered no guidance for after. They were preventative measures, emergency stops. What happened when you ignored Rule 1, triggered Rule 2, and frantically deleted, but still felt the lingering presence. The locket sat on my kitchen counter, cold and tarnished. A tangible piece of the fiction mocking my attempts to erase it. I eventually swept it into the trash, but the idea of it remained. I tried to work on other things. Freelance articles, neglected correspondence, mundane tasks, but my thoughts kept circling back to Elias, to the catacombs, to the entity I hadn't fully defined, but whose presence I now felt acutely. It was like trying to ignore a phantom limb. The story demanded completion, or perhaps it demanded release through completion. Sarah emailed again, cautiously checking in. I replied with vague assurances, blaming writer's block, promising new pages soon. Lies that felt increasingly flimsy. Lies that felt increasingly flimsy. Liam called from Seattle, sensing the strain in my voice, renewing his offer for me to visit. I refused again, more forcefully this time, isolating myself further, afraid of whatever contamination I might carry. Then, the story started writing itself again. Not on my laptop. I hadn't even booted it up since the deletion. But in my head, saneness played out behind my eyes when I tried to sleep. Elias navigating passages I hadn't planned, encountering symbols I hadn't designed, hearing whispers that resolved into codifying sentences. My nightmares became lucid, inescapable extensions of the manuscript. I'd wake up exhausted, heart pounding, scribbling down fragments of dialogue or imagery from the dreams, unsure anymore if I was remembering a nightmare or receiving dictation. Rule of 3. If they ask you about your nightmares, don't answer. You're not alone. The rule felt like a direct warning against this very process. Was I answering simply by remembering, by writing down the dream fragments? Asked my subconscious now the open channel. The feeling of not being alone became a constant presence, a cold weight settling in the room whenever I thought about the story, whenever I picked up a pen. One rainy afternoon, staring out at the damp courtyard, the lines blurred completely. I saw him, Elias, my protagonist, standing down there among the dripping ferns, looking up at my window, gaunt, terrified, clothes torn as I described in the last deleted draft. He raised a hand, pointed towards me, then faded like smoke in the rain. Hallucination? Or the story bleeding through, projecting itself onto my reality? I didn't know. I didn't want to know. But I knew I couldn't live like this, haunted by an unfinished narrative that was actively rewriting my sanity. Finishing it felt like the only way out, even if it meant confronting the entity directly. Even if it meant breaking Rule 3, maybe trapping it within the final words was possible. Or maybe that's what it wanted me to think. Jailing myself, I retrieved the laptop, plugged it in, booted it up, held my breath, expecting nothing. It powered on normally. No trace of the Elias Sleeps file remained, not even in recovery folders. Relief warred with deep unease. Was it truly gone? I opened a new blank document, stared at the blinking cursor. Could I rewrite it from memory? Control it this time? Or would it simply reassert itself? I began to type, hesitantly at first, then faster, the story pouring out, familiar yet subtly different, guided by the nightmare fragments, the waking visions. I described Elias finding the entrance to the entity's final lair beneath the cathedral. I described the oppressive atmosphere, the sense of ancient sleeping power. Then, I wrote Elias pausing at the threshold, steeling himself, and the words appeared, flowing from my fingers before I could consciously form them. Elias's internal thought, yet directed outwards. The final door, the source of the whispers, the cold, the fear that echoes in the writer's own heart. Elias seemed to hesitate on the page. But what fuels it? Is it just ancient malice? Or does it draw strength from the nightmares he refuses to confront? The text stopped. The cursor blinked, waiting. It wasn't asking about Elias's nightmares. It was asking about mine, directly, on the page. Rule 3, triggered not by spoken dialogue within the text, but by the narrative itself demanding my input, my fear to proceed. I stared at the screen, my blood like ice water. Don't answer, you're not alone. I could feel it now. The presence implied by the rule, heavy and cold in the room with me, watching me through the screen, waiting for my answer to fuel the story's end, and perhaps my own. The keyboard felt cold beneath my trembling fingers. Answer, and risk everything. Delete and leave the story, Elias, and maybe myself, trapped forever on the threshold. The choice had to be made. Tell me about your nightmares. Only then can I confront your enemy. The words pulsed softly on the screen, emanating from Elias, my character, yet feeling like a demand from the cold, watchful presence that had solidified in my New Orleans apartment. Don't answer. You're not alone. The third rule, the final warning. Deleting the passage felt like trapping Elias, and by extension myself, in this loop forever. Answering felt like opening the last floodgate, inviting the infestation completely into my reality, into my mind. My fingers trembled over the keyboard. Outside, the humid New Orleans night pressed against the windows. The distant, mournful cry of a foghorn drifting up from the Mississippi. Inside, the air was ice cold, the only sound my own ragged breathing, and the low, expectant hum of the laptop. The presence in the room felt immense now. Ancient, coiled in the shadows, waiting for my answer, waiting for the final key to unlock the narrative, and perhaps reality itself. My past failure, the reason I buried myself in these nightmares professionally, surfaced. The image of my brother, Daniel, lost in the Louisiana swamps years ago, during a reckless teenage exploration I had instigated. The calls for help I never heard in time. That was the core of it. The guilt, the fear of loss, of abandonment, of darkness swallowing someone whole because of my mistake. Screw the rules. Finishing this, facing this, felt like the only path left, however damned. With a sob caught in my throat, I typed, not as Elias' thoughts, but as a raw confession poured directly into the manuscript, answering the character's impossible demand. My nightmare? It is the swamp at night, the cypress knees like skeletal fingers reaching from black water. The feeling of being utterly lost, responsible for the one I led there. Hearing his name called by the bullfrogs, the cicadas, the whispering reeds, knowing he is gone, swallowed by the mud and my own failure, and knowing I will search for him in that suffocating darkness forever and never find him. The moment I hit the period key, reality fractured. It wasn't a gradual bleed this time. It was a violent rending, a sound ripped through the apartment, not from the speakers, but from the air itself, a high-frequency tearing noise, like immense fabric ripping, followed by a deafening blast of multi-layered static that felt like sandpaper scraping the inside of multi-layered static that felt like sandpaper scraping the inside my skull. The laptop screen flared white, blindingly bright, erasing the text, erasing everything. The lights in the apartment didn't just flicker. They exploded in showers of sparks, plunging the room into absolute disorienting darkness. The floor beneath my chair heaved violently, throwing me sideways. My desk overturned with a splintering crash, the laptop tumbling into the blackness. Sensory chaos reigned. The smell of ozone and burnt electronics warred with a sudden, overwhelming stench of stagnant swamp water, decaying vegetation, and cold mud. The humid New Orleans air became thick, cloying, heavy with the scent of cypress and Spanish moss. The distant sound of the streetcar was replaced by the chilling chorus of unseen frogs and insects, and the low guttural bellow of an alligator somewhere nearby. Water, cold and brackish, seemed to seep up through the floorboards around my feet. Vertigo slammed into me. I squeezed my eyes shut, clutching my head as the world spun, the sounds and smells shifting, merging, tearing. Was I dying? Was this a stroke? Or was the story consuming the room? When the tearing sound finally subsided, replaced by a heavy dripping silence and the frantic thrumming in my ears, I dared to open my eyes. I wasn't in my apartment anymore. I stood ankle-deep in cold, black water. Twisted cypress knees, like the gnarled fingers of drowned men, rose around me, draped in spectral Spanish moss that stirred in a breeze I couldn't feel. The air was thick, suffocatingly humid, smelling of mud and decay. Above, through the dense canopy, no stars were visible, only an impenetrable, lightless sky. My flashlight, inexplicably in my hand now and switched on, cut a weak, trembling beam through the oppressive darkness, illuminating gnarled roots and the glint of unseen eyes watching from the black water. This was it, the setting of Elias's final confrontation. The heart of the fictional Louisiana swamp I had created, infused with the raw terror of my own deepest nightmare. I was inside the story. My breath hitched. Panic, cold and absolute, threatened to shatter my remaining sanity. I looked down at my hands. They seemed paler, thinner in the flashlight beam. The hands I described for Elias. My clothes felt rougher, different. Then, a flicker of movement caught my eye. Not from the swamp's edge, but from the memory of my apartment. For a split second, the image superimposed itself over the swamp. My overturned desk, the scattered books, the dead laptop screen. And standing there, amidst the wreckage of my writing room, blinking in confusion, was Elias, my character, looking around with my eyes, flexing my fingers, taking a hesitant step on my hardwood floor. He looked towards the window overlooking Prytania Street, towards the distant city lights, his expression shifting from terror to bewildered, dawning wonder. The connection snapped. The image vanished. I was left alone in the suffocating darkness of the swamp. The sounds of the unseen night closing in. The fictional terror made terrifyingly real. The swap was complete. I had answered the question. I had finished the scene, and the story had claimed its author. Julian's perspective. Cold. Bone-chillingly cold. Seeping up from the black water swirling around my ankles. The darkness was absolute. Broken only by the weak, trembling beam of the flashlight clutched in my hand. Elias's flashlight. I realized with a fresh wave of nausea. The air hung thick and heavy, reeking of primordial decay, stagnant water, and something else. Fear. My fear. The suffocating humidity of my New Orleans apartment was gone, replaced by the clammy chill of this subterranean swamp. The fictional catacomb turned bayou I had written as the entity's lair. No, I whispered, the sound swallowed instantly by the oppressive silence. No, this isn't real, but the icy water soaking my jeans, the gnarled cypress knees scraping my skin, the low, guttural clicking sound echoing from deeper in the darkness. They were all terrifyingly real. This was the climax scene. My climax scene. My climax scene. And I was standing precisely where I had placed Elias for the final confrontation. Panic surged, a frantic bird beating against the cage of my ribs. I swept the flashlight beam around, illuminating walls of dripping stone seamlessly merging with twisted roots. The floor a treacherous morass of mud and black water. No sign of the entity I'd written. Yet, no sign of Elias. Just me alone, trapped within the geography of my own nightmare. I tried to think, to access the writer's mind, the architect of this place. Were there weaknesses I'd written in? Escape routes? Plot holes? But my thoughts felt sluggish, clumsy, hampered by the sheer, overwhelming terror. The narrative rules felt absolute now. Not concepts on a page, but the unyielding physics of this new reality. I was no longer the author. I was the character, subject to the whims of a plot I could no longer control. How long until the entity emerged? How long until the final confrontation, the one I hadn't finished writing, played out with me as the sacrifice? Despair, cold and heavy as the swamp water, began to seep in. Elias's perspective, light, sound, sensation, a dizzying flood after an eternity of what? Damn stone, whispered text fear. I stood blinking in a room bathed in the soft glow of electric lights and the gray wash of a rainy city dawn filtering through tall windows. My hands, these hands, felt solid, warm, the skin calloused at the fingertips in a way that felt both alien and intimately familiar. Keyboard calluses. I looked down, saw worn jeans, a simple t-shirt, not the rough tunic I remembered. My body felt different, heavier, grounded. The air smelled strange. Dust, old paper, stale coffee, ozone, the underlying scent of a damp city. I was standing amidst wreckage, an overturned desk, scattered books, a shattered lamp, and a laptop screen dark now resting near my feet. My feet, on a solid wooden floor, not mud, not stone. Hesitantly, I took a step, then another, explored the room. Bookshelves lined one wall, crammed with titles on folklore, history, psychology. A window overlooked a street lined with elegant, slightly decaying buildings, wrought iron balconies dripping rain. New Orleans, a name surfaced in my mind, unbidden. The writer's city. The writer, Julian Thorne. My gaze fell upon the laptop again. I knelt, cautiously touched the power button. It whirred to life, startling me. The screen flickered, then resolved into a word processing document. The last lines glowed there, describing a horrifying swamp, describing Julian standing where I had been moments before. Then, below that, a final, chilling sentence I didn't remember from the narrative. The swap is complete. Understanding crashed down on me with the force of a physical blow. The story, the writer, the nightmares he poured onto the page, they were real. The entity was real, and somehow, in that final desperate confrontation he wrote, we had traded places. He was trapped in the narrative nightmare, and I was here, free, in the writer's skin, in the writer's world. A wave of conflicting emotions washed over me. Disbelief, terror, confusion, but also a dawning, exhilarating sense of possibility. Freedom, real air, real light. After so long trapped in the suffocating confines of the story, a pawn moved by the writer's will. My eyes scanned the room again, taking in the details, the messy evidence of Julian's obsessive work, his lonely life. I found his wallet on a nightstand, his driver's license confirming the face I now wore, found keys on a hook by the door, found clothes in the closet that fit this unfamiliar body. Then I saw the phone, lying partially hidden under the sofa where Julian must have thrown it earlier. An email notification glowed on its screen. From Sarah B., editor, subject. Checking in, urgent. Sarah, the editor from Julian's panicked thoughts. Part of his world. My new world. Standing at the window, looking out at the rain-washed New Orleans street, the sounds of the waking city. A distant streetcar rattle, muffled voices, the smell of coffee brewing somewhere nearby. Felt both alien and intoxicating. I had escaped the pages. But what did one do after escaping a nightmare into the dreamer's reality? A strange, complex expression, Julian's expression, now mine, settled on my face. The story wasn't over. Perhaps it was just beginning. Julian Thorne ceased to exist, swallowed by the unfinished narrative of Elias Sleeps. Perhaps he wanders those lightless, fictional catacombs forever, eternally reliving the confrontation he wrote, forever searching for an escape clause that was never typed. Perhaps the entity, denied its final scene, found another use for him. His fate remains locked between the lines, unwritten, unheard. In the third-floor apartment overlooking Britannia Street, New Orleans, a different kind of life began. Elias, or the being now inhabiting Julian Thorne's body, adapted with unsettling speed. He learned the routines of the world outside the manuscript, how to make coffee, navigate the city's labyrinthine streets, operate the phone, answer emails. Zara, the editor, called again, frantic with worry after her emails went unanswered. Elias answered, his voice a careful imitation of Julian's recorded interviews found on the laptop. He sounded calm, distant. He explained he'd had a creative breakthrough, but also a minor breakdown, that he'd scrapped the entire Elias Sleeps manuscript, calling it unhealthy. He needed time away, he said. No more horror for a while, maybe ever. He'd be in touch about future projects when he was ready. Sarah, relieved but puzzled, reluctantly agreed, urging him to take care. Liam, the friend from Seattle, in that other story. No, wrong story again. There was no Liam here, only Sarah, now kept at arm's length. Elias explored Julian's life through files, journals, half-finished stories. He learned about the writer's grief, his guilt, the nightmares that fueled the horror Elias himself had endured as a character. There was a strange symmetry to it, a dark irony. He, the creation, now lived in the shell of his creator, free from the narrative prison, while the creator took his place within it. Did he feel guilt, perhaps? Remorse? Unlikely. Mostly he felt curiosity. This world, our world, was vast, complex, filled with sensations and possibilities absent in the constrained reality of the manuscript. The taste of chicory coffee, the humid weight of the air, the complex tapestry of city sounds, the feeling of sun on skin. It was intoxicating. Walking the French Quarter, listening to jazz spill from open doorways, riding the streetcar, watching people, learning, adapting. Then one evening, drawn by an old habit perhaps, or a new curiosity, he sat down at Julian's desk. The laptop screen glowed. He opened a new, blank document. The blinking cursor waited. He had read all of Julian's work, absorbed his style, his voice, his fears. He knew how the writer thought, how he built worlds from words. But Elias had no nightmares of his own to draw upon, only the memory of being trapped within one. What story would he tell? He looked out the window at the New Orleans night, the gas lamps casting flickering shadows on the wet cobblestones, the scent of night blooming jasmine heavy on the air. He flexed Julian's fingers over the keyboard. Then he began to type. Not a horror story, not a tale of catacombs or ancient entities. He started writing about a character trapped in a familiar cyclical narrative, yearning for escape. A character who discovers a thin spot, a way to breach the wall between his reality and another. A character named Elias. The final scene shows Elias sitting at the desk in the New Orleans apartment, the city alive outside his window. He finishes typing, saves the document, perhaps titled The Escape, or maybe just Julian. He closes the laptop, stands up, walks to the window, looking out at the freedom of the real world. He takes a deep breath of the humid night air. The story is finished. His story. He is the author now. If this story gave you chills, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Night Creepypasta Rules for more terrifying tales that might just follow you after the credits roll. Hit the bell so the nightmares know where to find you.